There is something you have probably never admitted out loud, that some of the most alive you have ever felt was during a period of genuine suffering, not in spite of what was happening to you, because of it. And that quiet, slightly embarrassing fact is worth sitting with, because it points towards something philosophy has been circling for a very long time. We tend to approach suffering the way we approach a malfunction. Something has gone wrong. The task is to locate the fault, correct it, and return to the baseline. Medicine thinks this way. Most of our self-help culture thinks this way. Even a great deal of moral philosophy has thought this way, suffering as a deficit to be eliminated, a negative space where well-being should be. And none of that is simply mistaken. Pain does damage. Loss is real. The desire to reduce unnecessary suffering in the world is among the most decent impulses a person can have. But there is another possibility, one that is harder to hold and harder still to say without sounding as though you are romanticizing cruelty. What if suffering is not a departure from human experience, but something closer to its interior structure? What if the moments when life strips something away from you, a relationship, a certainty, a version of yourself you had grown comfortable with, are precisely the moments when you begin to encounter what you actually are, beneath all the arrangements you had made to avoid that encounter? That is not a comfortable thought. It is not meant to be. But discomfort, you may be starting to notice, is exactly where this conversation lives. Across centuries and cultures, certain people sat down with that discomfort and refused to look away from it. They wrote, they argued, they revised. They suffered themselves in many cases in ways that shaped everything they came to believe. Their voices are worth listening to carefully, and we are about to. Seneca was born around 4 years before the Common Era, in what Rome called, and he died in the year 65, on the orders of an emperor he had once tutored. That last detail matters. Seneca did not write about suffering from a philosopher's armchair. He wrote from inside it, from years of exile on the island of Corsica, from the slow corruption of a court he could not leave, from the knowledge, in his final years, that Nero's suspicion had made his death a matter of time. When the order came, he opened his veins and bled slowly, reportedly dictating to his secretaries until near the end. The man and the philosophy were, in this sense, continuous. He did not perform stoicism in his study and abandon it in the world. The world pressed on him, and the philosophy pressed back. What Seneca inherited from the Stoic tradition, from Zeno, from reshaped by his own Roman temperament, was a conviction that the inner life is the only province over which a person has genuine sovereignty. Fortune governs everything else: health, reputation, wealth, the length of one's days. But fortune does not govern judgment, and it does not govern the orientation of the will. Suffering, then, presented itself to Seneca not as an argument against living well, but as its most serious examination. Easy circumstances, he thought, reveal very little about a person. Adversity reveals everything. This was not a consoling thought dressed up as philosophy. It was a structural claim that virtue untested is not quite virtue yet. It is only potential, a promise the soul has made to itself but not yet kept. He returned to this idea in many forms across the letters and essays he wrote in his final years, those extraordinary works composed under the shadow of his own ending. Suffering, for Seneca, functions like fire applied to metal. It does not create what was never there, but it does reveal and harden what was. The person who has never been tested has no way of knowing and no way of demonstrating what they actually are. And so providence, as Seneca framed it in his essay of that name, is not cruel in sending good people hardship. It is precise. It is attending to them seriously. The man who goes unchallenged, he wrote, might suspect in his quieter moments that he has simply been overlooked. There is a line in his writing that arrives with the quiet weight of something he has earned rather than invented.
There is no easy way from the earth to the stars.
It is one of those sentences that sounds at first like encouragement and then opens into something colder and more honest. Seneca is not promising that difficulty leads somewhere worth going. He is saying that the nature of what is worth going toward makes difficulty structurally inevitable. The hardship is not incidental. It is the road itself. And this is where his thinking on suffering begins to feel less like philosophy applied to life, and more like a description of life as it actually presents itself. To anyone paying close enough attention to notice that what they most deeply are has never once been forged in comfort. Seneca gave us suffering as a forge, something to be entered, endured, and emerged from harder and more truly oneself. It is a powerful image, but it is also, finally, an image of conquest. The self stands on the other side. The pain is behind it. What happens when a thinker refuses that architecture entirely, when the movement is not through suffering and out, but simply and honestly in? Was a French nobleman who retired from public life in 1571, at the age of 38, to a tower on his family estate in the. He had watched plague move through France. He had seen the religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots reduce his country to a place of casual, ordinary brutality, neighbors murdering neighbors over doctrines neither side fully understood. He had lost his closest friend, to illness, and felt the loss as a kind of amputation of himself. He suffered, in the bodily sense, from kidney stones for much of his later life, attacks of genuine, prolonged pain that left him shaken and exhausted. He was not a man writing from the quiet distance of good health. In his tower he began to write what he called essays, a word he took from the French, meaning an attempt, a trial, a weighing. The form itself was an argument. He was not building a system. He was not trying to arrive. He was trying to look carefully and without flinching at what was actually there in the world and in himself. And what he found again and again was that the self is not a stable thing to be fortified. It shifts. It contradicts itself. It feels one way on Tuesday and another way entirely on Thursday. Suffering, in its pages, does not reveal a bedrock self beneath the surface. It reveals that there may be no bedrock, only the surface, rippling and alive. This is a genuinely unsettling idea and knew it, but he did not treat it as a crisis to be resolved. He treated it as a texture to be inhabited. When he writes about his kidney stones, he is not performing courage. He is noting, with something almost like curiosity, how the body makes its own demands, how pain interrupts thought, how one recovers and then forgets, and then suffers again and then forgets again. There is no lesson extracted. The experience is not converted into moral capital. It is simply witnessed. This is where parts company with almost every philosopher who came before him. Philosophy had long been in the business of transformation, taking raw suffering and returning it as wisdom, as virtue, as freedom. is almost alone in suggesting that the act of honest attention might be enough, not attention as a path to something else, attention as the thing itself. To sit with pain and describe it truly, without consolation, without conclusion, is already a form of dignity. The essay, for, is not a record of having understood. It is the understanding happening in real time on the page. Gave us the self as a fair witness, restless, contradictory, honestly observed. But one question he left standing: why is there so much to observe? Why does the examined life return again and again, to discomfort, to longing, to the peculiar ache of never quite arriving? Arthur took that question and drove it underground, deeper than temperament, deeper than circumstance, until he reached what he believed was bedrock. What he found there was not reassuring. Was born in Danzig in 1788, the son of a prosperous merchant who died young, possibly by suicide, and a mother who became a celebrated novelist and showed little grief at his absence. Arthur inherited money enough to think, and spent much of his life thinking alone in Frankfurt, with a succession of poodles he named after his own philosophical hero, Kant. He was quarrelsome, vain, and profoundly serious, and he finished his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, at 30. It was ignored for decades. He lived long enough to see it finally recognized, and the recognition seemed, characteristically, to give him little peace. His central argument begins with a move that is almost disarmingly simple. When we look at the world, we see objects, causes, forms, the whole theater of representation. But when we look inward, we do not find an object. We find something that strains and presses and reaches, something that wants. Called this the will. And then he made his audacious claim that this same straining, this same blind insistence, is what everything is. Not just humans, every creature, every plant bending toward light, every river wearing down stone, all of it the outward face of one ceaseless, directionless wanting.
My body and my will are one.
Once you see that, suffering is no longer a complication of life. It is not bad luck or poor management. It is the structure of the thing itself. The will has no terminus. It achieves one object only to find itself reaching for the next. And when there is nothing to reach for, what remains is boredom, which considered barely an improvement on pain. We oscillate, he said, between suffering and boredom as between two poles, because striving and emptiness are all the will knows how to do. There is no resolution waiting on the other side of effort, only more effort, or the hollow absence of it.
Every time a man is begotten and born, the clock of human life is wound up anew to repeat once more its same old tune that has already been played innumerable times, movement by movement and measure by measure, with insignificant variations.
This is not pessimism as a mood. It is pessimism as a metaphysics, a precise account of why existence takes the form it takes. And what makes extraordinary is that he did not stop there. If the source of suffering is the will's insistence on perpetuating itself, then the rare moments of relief come precisely when that insistence is suspended. Great music, he thought, does this, lets us contemplate pure form without desire reaching in to claim it. Compassion does it differently, dissolving the illusion that my suffering and yours are separate things. And in the figures of tragedy, he found the most radical gesture of all, the voluntary turning away, the willingness to stop wanting entirely. was not offering consolation in any ordinary sense. He was offering clarity, a vision of the human condition stripped of the flattering story that things will improve, that desire satisfied brings rest. What it leaves behind is something sterner and strangely dignified. The knowledge that to suffer is not to have failed, but to have taken seriously the nature of what you are. Had looked at the will driving all living things and found it monstrous, an engine of craving with no destination, generating suffering as naturally as fire generates heat. His answer, as we have seen, was to extinguish the engine itself, to achieve a state of pure, will-less contemplation, a kind of waking death that he regarded as wisdom. It was a diagnosis delivered with extraordinary honesty, and a prescription delivered with a kind of weary relief. Nietzsche read as a young man and felt the shock of recognition that every serious reader of feels. He accepted the diagnosis almost entirely. Yes, suffering is pervasive. Yes, the will is blind and insatiable. Yes, most of the consolations on offer are illusions. What Nietzsche could not accept was what came next, the turn toward quietism, the valorizing of negation, the idea that the highest response to life's pain was to want less and less of it until you wanted none at all. Nietzsche was himself a man who suffered enormously in the body, debilitating migraines, failing eyesight, years of nausea and collapse, long periods of near-total isolation in cheap boarding houses in Switzerland and northern Italy. He was not speaking about suffering from a position of comfort. He was speaking from inside it, and what he noticed inside it was something had missed. What he noticed was that the suffering that had actually shaped him, the kind that pressed hardest, had not diminished him. It had, over time, clarified him. Not because pain is good, and not in any sentimental sense, but because resistance reveals structure. A weight you cannot lift shows you exactly where you are weak, and that knowledge, unbearable as it is also the first condition of becoming stronger. Nietzsche began to suspect that the will wanted to negate was not the problem. The problem was what you did with it, whether you turned it against life or let life use it to surpass itself. This is the thought behind what he called love of fate, and behind the more demanding idea of the eternal recurrence, the thought experiment in which you ask yourself whether you could will your life to repeat, with every suffering intact, infinitely. It is not a cosmological claim. It is a test of your relationship to your own existence. Could you want it again? Not despite the suffering, but including it. Because the suffering was not separate from what you became, it was part of the material out of which you were made. Nietzsche was suspicious of pity, including his own. He knew he was prone to it.
This is the mistake which I seem to make eternally, that I imagine the sufferings of others as far greater than they really are. Ever since my childhood, the proposition, my greatest dangers lie in pity, has been confirmed again and again.
The danger he sensed in pity was not callousness. It was a specific philosophical risk, that to see another person primarily through the lens of their suffering is to reduce them, to see only what they have not yet overcome, and in doing so to deny them the very dignity of their struggle. Pity, for Nietzsche, was a way of looking at suffering that secretly preferred it to stay, because suffering was what justified the pity in the first place. He was asking for something harder than resignation, and harder than sympathy. He was asking whether a human being could stand inside their own pain and find, not consolation, but affirmation, a yes spoken not in spite of everything but because of it. That is a demand most of us will never fully meet, but it reframes the question entirely. Suffering is no longer something happening to you that you must endure or escape. It becomes the very medium in which a life either contracts into itself or discovers what it is capable of becoming. And then there is, who arrives at the end of this long conversation like a correction to everything that came before, not a refutation, but a deepening that changes the shape of the question entirely. She was a French philosopher and mystic who lived only 34 years. Dying in 1943 of tuberculosis, she had almost certainly worsened by refusing to eat more than the ration allotted to those under German occupation in France. She had worked in automobile factories to understand the suffering of laborers from the inside. She had gone to the front lines in Spain. She was, by any measure, someone who did not theorize suffering from a safe distance. She moved toward it, deliberately, as toward a source of light too bright to look at directly. Nietzsche told us that the will, properly hardened, could transmute pain into power, that what does not kill us becomes the sculptor of greatness. And there is something true in that. But notice something the Nietzschean picture cannot accommodate, that certain kinds of suffering do not forge the self. They dissolve it. She gave this a specific name, not pain, not hardship, not even grief, but affliction. In French, a condition in which physical pain, social degradation, and the sense of abandonment converge so completely that the person who suffers can no longer quite believe in their own worth, their own reality. The slave, the prisoner, the utterly destitute, these are not people being tested and tempered. These are people being unmade. For this unmaking was not the end of the story. It was, extraordinarily, its turning point. Because the self that ordinarily stands between us and reality, the ego that negotiates, defends, accumulates, asserts, is precisely what affliction strips away. And when that architecture of selfhood collapses, something else becomes possible. Not power, not even resilience, something closer to permeability, an openness to what she called grace. The faculty through which this grace enters is attention, a concept places at the very center of her moral and spiritual philosophy. Attention, for her, is not concentration or effort. It is almost the opposite, a kind of patient, waiting emptiness directed toward another person or toward the world, without agenda, without the self rushing in to interpret and appropriate. It is extraordinarily difficult precisely because the self wants so badly to be active, to be useful, to be present in the consoling way. Real attention requires a prior self-emptying.
Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity.
She is not offering consolation here. She is explicitly refusing it. For consolation is one of the great spiritual traps, the place where religion most often fails, by rushing to make suffering bearable rather than allowing it to do its terrifying, necessary work. The self that has been comforted has not been transformed. It has simply been restored to its former smallness. What is pointing toward haltingly, because language keeps trying to domesticate it, is the possibility that suffering, at its most absolute, opens a dimension of experience that cannot be reached any other way. Not because pain is good, not because affliction should be sought, but because the human being, ordinarily so defended, so enclosed, occasionally finds in the ruins of that enclosure something that was always just outside it. a contact with what is real, a light that does not comfort but clarifies. And that, perhaps, is where this long inquiry arrives, not at an answer but at a threshold. Suffering is the medium through which we discover what we are, and what we are, it turns out, is not quite finished being discovered. What remains after all of these voices is not a verdict. It is something more like a recognition, quiet, slightly vertiginous, that the question was never really what do we do with suffering, but what does suffering do with us? Seneca wrote his letters from the edge of an emperor's patience, knowing the hemlock or the blade was a real possibility, and still he kept writing. Retreated to his tower and found, in the examination of his own pain and confusion, not answers but an education in what a human being actually is when the performance drops away. Stared into the grinding will that underlies everything and refused to look away, even when what he saw offered no comfort. Nietzsche took that same darkness and asked whether a person could love it, not tolerate it, not manage it, but love it, the way you love something you cannot be without. And perhaps most radically, suggested that the point of contact between a human soul and reality is almost always a place that hurts. These are not compatible philosophies. They do not agree on God, on meaning, on what the self even is. But they share something beneath the arguments, a refusal to treat suffering as an interruption. They all sensed, each in their own idiom, that to rush past difficulty, to fix it, to reframe it, to medicate it into silence, is to miss something irreplaceable about what it means to be here, conscious, mortal, oriented toward other people who will also suffer and also die. You are left, then, not with a solution but with a posture, an invitation to remain present inside difficulty long enough to let it speak, not because that is pleasant, and not because there is guaranteed wisdom waiting on the other side, but because the alternative, which is a life organized entirely around the avoidance of pain, turns out to be organized around something that is not life at all.